when two dirty cops brutally murdered a dedicated father in front of his young son. They thought they'd buried their secret forever. 2 decades later, the son returns with a vengeance, determined to uncover the truth behind the tragedy that still haunts him. What he discovers will shake him to his core and leave you speechless. Who was really behind his father's murder, and how far does the conspiracy go? Stay tuned to find out. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. If gripping stories of justice and redemption inspire you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the lake. Jack Reynolds sat on a weathered wooden dock, his fishing rod resting on his lap, watching the calm ripples in the water. His 10-year-old son, Noah, sat beside him, legs dangling over the edge. "Think we'll catch anything today, Dad?" Noah asked, his voice soft but hopeful. Jack glanced at his son and smiled. "Maybe, if we're patient enough." He ruffled Noah's hair. "It's not really about the fish anyway." Noah didn't respond, but his quiet grin said enough. This was their time together, away from the noise of the city, away from Jack's demanding job as a police officer. It was just them, the water and the woods. They'd been out for hours, and the sun had begun its slow descent, painting the lake with shades of orange and purple. Jack stood up, stretching his back, ready to head home. "Bud?" he asked, his voice relaxed. Noah nodded, standing up and dusting off his pants. Jack reeled in his line and packed away the tackle box, savoring the quiet. But as he grabbed the gear and turned to leave, something shifted in the air. The calmness that surrounded them began to feel unnatural, almost too still. Then Jack heard it, a rustling from the trees behind them. His eyes narrowed. He wasn't the type to get jumpy, but his instincts, honed from years on the force, kicked in fast. He put a hand on Noah's shoulder, firm but gentle. "Stay close to me," he whispered, the warmth leaving his voice. Noah's face tensed. "What is it?" Before Jack could answer, 2 men emerged from the woods, their faces covered by black ski masks. They moved with purpose, too confident. Jack's stomach dropped. This wasn't a robbery or a random attack. He knew that walk. They were coming for him. Without missing a beat, Jack pushed Noah behind him. "Run, Noah," he said quietly but urgently. "Hide. Now, but go." Jack's voice rose, a rare show of panic. Noah froze for only a second, then darted into the nearby brush. He crouched low, heart pounding, peeking through the thick leaves to see what would happen next. His small hands shook as he clamped them over his mouth, trying to keep his breathing quiet. Jack stood tall, squaring his shoulders. He wasn't armed, not here, not with Noah. His badge wasn't going to help him now. The 2 masked men stopped a few feet away, one of them holding a gun pointed straight at Jack's chest. The taller of the 2 spoke, his voice low and steady. "You've been snooping around where you don't belong, Reynolds." Jack's pulse quickened, but he kept his face unreadable. "I don't know what you're talking about." The second man, shorter and bulkier, took a step forward, lifting the gun higher. "You know exactly what this is. You've gotten too close to something that isn't yours." Jack glanced toward the bushes where Noah was hiding, his heart sinking. His son didn't need to see this. He didn't need to witness what was coming. But Jack knew there was no way out. He took a slow step forward, putting himself between the gunman and the spot where Noah was hidden. "If this is about money, I'll give it to you," Jack said, his voice calm despite the dread crawling up his spine. "But not here. Not with my son watching." The taller man shook his head almost dismissively. "It's not about the money, Jack. It's about what you know." Before Jack could react, the shorter man pulled the trigger. The crack of the gunshot split the air. Jack staggered back, his hand instinctively going to his side, where blood was already spreading across his shirt. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. Noah, hidden in the bushes, felt his heart stop. He bit down hard on his lip, tears welling in his eyes. "Don't make a sound," he told himself. "Don't let them see you." Jack struggled to prop himself up, his breaths shallow and ragged. His vision blurred, but he kept his eyes on the masked men, refusing to show them the fear that was clawing at him. He had to stay strong for Noah. The taller man knelt beside him, pulling off his mask. Jack's eyes widened in recognition, but his mouth couldn't form the words. "You should have kept your nose out of it, Reynolds," the man whispered, his tone almost regretful. Then he raised his gun and fired 2 more shots, execution style. Jack's body went limp. From his hiding spot, Noah clamped his hand tighter over his mouth, tears streaming down his face. He had to stay hidden, had to stay quiet. The masked men didn't linger. They turned, leaving Jack's lifeless body on the ground, disappearing back into the trees as quickly as they had come. Noah waited, his entire body shaking, his mind screaming to go to his father. But he couldn't move. Not yet. Only when the woods were completely still again did Noah finally crawl out from his hiding spot. He ran to his father's side, dropping to his knees. "Dad," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Dad, please." But Jack didn't move. Noah reached for his father's hand, but it was cold, unresponsive. The reality hit him in waves. His dad was gone. The warmth of their day by the lake, the laughter they shared, all of it ripped away in an instant. Alone, Noah sat beside his father's body, the weight of the moment crushing him. He couldn't comprehend it yet, couldn't process what he had just witnessed. But deep down, something had changed, something irreversible. Noah jolted awake, drenched in sweat. His heart raced, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps, as he stared up at the ceiling, still half caught in the nightmare. The darkness of his bedroom seemed to close in around him, his father's last moments flashing in his mind. The masked men, the gunshots, the final breath his father took. "Hey, hey," came a soft voice beside him. His wife, Sarah, turned over, reaching for him. Another nightmare. Noah rubbed a hand over his face, trying to steady himself. He could feel his pulse hammering beneath his skin, the cold dread from the dream still clinging to him like a second skin. "Yeah," he muttered, sitting up and swinging his legs over the edge of the bed. "Same one." Sarah shifted closer, her hand finding the small of his back. "You want to talk about it?" Noah shook his head. It's always the same. I'm there, I'm hiding, watching. I can't do anything. I couldn't save him." "It wasn't your fault," she said softly, pressing her cheek against his back. "I know," Noah said, but there was no conviction in his voice. He stared at the floor, his mind racing back to that day. There was something about it, something that had been gnawing at him for years, just beneath the surface. It never sat right. The men that killed his father weren't amateurs. They weren't just a couple of thugs looking for an easy target. They knew what they were doing. They knew who they were coming for. "They were too prepared," Noah muttered under his breath. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice still thick with sleep. Noah sighed, standing up from the bed, pacing slowly across the room. "Nothing. Just something about that day. It feels like it was planned, like they knew him." "You've said that before," Sarah replied, watching him pace slowly. "But Noah, you were 10. It's easy for the mind to play tricks on you. You've spent so many years replaying it. I know what I saw, Sarah, he snapped, then immediately regretted the sharpness in his tone. He stopped pacing, turning to face her. I'm sorry, it's just, I keep thinking, maybe I missed something. Something I should have seen. Sarah sighed, the fatigue weighing down her voice. You've been trying to piece it together for years, but maybe there's nothing left to find. She patted the space on the bed beside her. Come back to bed. Noah hesitated, his mind racing too fast. Too many thoughts swirling around. The image of those men, the way they moved, the calmness in their actions. It wasn't random. He was sure of that now, but he couldn't put the pieces together. And the frustration gnawed at him. I just need some air, Noah said, heading toward the door. Sarah lay back down, pulling the blanket over her. Okay, just don't stay up all night. Noah gave a brief nod and slipped out of the bedroom, making his way down the hallway to the kitchen. He flipped on the light. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the quiet house. He leaned against the counter, staring at the half-empty coffee pot from the day before. His father's face swam up from his memory, the stern but kind expression, the way he always seemed so sure of himself. Noah had idolized him, always following him around, always wanting to be just like him. He remembered asking his dad if he ever got scared. Fear's part of the job, kiddo, his dad had said, ruffling his hair, but you face it. You don't run from it. Noah let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. His father had been a good cop. Honest. The kind that made enemies because he didn't back down. And that's what was eating at him. His gut told him that his father had made the wrong enemies. The kind that wouldn't stop until he was dead. He glanced at the clock on the microwave. It was almost 5 a.m. Before he knew it, he needed to get ready for work. Noah trudged back to the bedroom, careful not to wake Sarah. He grabbed his clothes and headed for the bathroom. The steam from the hot shower did little to relax the tension in his shoulders, but it helped him focus. He'd spent his entire life running from the ghosts of that day, but instead of letting them crush him, he'd channeled that drive into something else, something bigger. Noah pulled on his shirt and stared at his reflection in the mirror. A different man looked back at him now. The boy who had watched his father die had grown into a man determined to honor his memory, an FBI agent, just like his father had dreamed of being one day. He didn't just protect people. He hunted down those who thought they were above the law, just like the men who took his father's life. He ran a hand through his hair, still dripping wet, and headed out to the kitchen. Sarah was already up, her coffee cup in hand as she stood by the counter. "You're up early," she said with a sleepy smile. Noah kissed her on the cheek and grabbed his keys. "Yeah, work." "Be careful," she said, her eyes lingering on him a moment longer. Noah nodded and slipped out the door, his mind already moving back to the case he was working on. He wasn't just chasing ghosts anymore. He had work to do. Noah's car pulled into the parking lot of the FBI field office as the sun broke over the horizon, casting a dull orange glow across the building. His mind was still running on fumes from the nightmare, but work had a way of grounding him, giving him something else to focus on. He killed the engine and stared through the windshield for a moment, gathering himself. Inside, the office buzzed with early morning energy. Agents on phones, clicking through reports, gathering files. It was a controlled chaos Noah had grown used to. He walked past the bullpen toward the back, heading for the conference room where his team was already gathered. Agent Karen Hall stood at the head of the room, flipping through a case file. She looked up when Noah entered. "About time, Reynolds. Thought you got lost on the way in." Noah smirked and slid into a seat at the table. "Caught in traffic," he said, though everyone knew he was lying. "All right," Hall said, getting back to business. "Let's get to it. We're focusing all resources on the Carter ring. We've got enough intel to suggest they're moving product through the precinct, and a few uniforms are on the payroll. Our goal is to start cracking down from the middle and work our way up the chain." Noah stiffened in his chair. The Carter ring had been a nightmare for law enforcement for months. They had been running drugs, arms, and whatever else they could move right under their noses. But what had grabbed his attention more than anything was that their suspected connections led back to his father's old precinct, his father's old case files. "Roy Tate," Hall said, updating the case files with a grim face. "Mid-level officer, works out of the 22nd. He's been flagged for suspicious behavior, mysterious deposits, unusual traffic in and out of his home, and contacts with known associates of the ring." Noah's pulse quickened. The 22nd precinct, his father's precinct. He clenched his jaw, pushing down the personal angle that threatened to bubble up. "Tate's been on the force for nearly 20 years, Hall continued. "He's kept a low profile, but our sources suggest he's the guy handling Carter's operations inside the precinct. We're bringing him in for questioning today." Noah glanced at the photos in the file. Tate looked like any other cop, middle-aged, graying at the temples, a bit of weight in the gut. His expression in the photos was calm, almost smug. He didn't scream drug trafficker. But Noah had learned a long time ago that appearances meant nothing. Hall wrapped up the briefing, tapping the case file for emphasis. "Reynolds, you're taking the lead on the interrogation. Let's see what he knows." Noah sat across from Tate in the cold, sterile interrogation room. The two-way mirror reflected back a partial view of his face, but his focus was on the man sitting opposite him, handcuffed to the table. Tate leaned back in his chair, the picture of indifference, his eyes flicking over Noah before he gave a slow grin. "FBI, huh?" he said. "Must be serious if they're pulling you guys in for questioning." Noah ignored the comment, flipping open the case file in front of him. "Officer Tate, we're investigating your possible involvement with the Carter drug trafficking operation. We know you've been in contact with associates of the ring." Tate's smile faded slightly, but he didn't flinch. "I don't know what you're talking about." Noah tapped the file. "We have surveillance footage of known drug dealers visiting your home. We have your bank records, mysterious cash deposits well above your salary. You want to explain that?" Tate's jaw clenched for a second, but he quickly masked it with a smirk. "Maybe I've got a side business. Isn't a crime to make extra money on the side." Noah leaned forward. "It is, if it's dirty money." Officer Tate's eyes narrowed. He shifted in his seat, clearly growing uncomfortable under the pressure. "Look, I'm not involved with Carter," Tate said. "I don't even know half the people you're talking about." "Really?" Noah raised an eyebrow. "You don't know them, but they seem to know you pretty well." Tate remained silent, his expression hardening. Noah let the pause stretch out. Silence had a way of unraveling people, but before Tate could speak, Noah pressed forward again. "Officer Tate, I don't think you fully understand what's happening here. We know you're the link between Carter and the precinct. That gives you two choices. Cooperate with us, or go down as the fall guy when this whole operation comes crashing down." Tate's smirk vanished completely. His face turned cold and calculating. His gaze drifted to the mirror, then back to Noah. "You're barking up the wrong tree," Tate said quietly. "Then who is?" Noah shot back. "You're not a low-level player in this, Tate. You've been in the game for years." Tate's eyes flicked up to Noah's face, then slowly shifted to the nameplate in front of him. Something changed in his posture. His gaze locked onto Noah's last name. "Reynolds," he said slowly. "Are you related to—" He stopped mid-sentence, squinting at Noah like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "Are you Jack Reynolds' kid?" Noah's entire body tensed. He tried to keep his expression neutral, but the shock was already rippling through him. He hadn't expected this. Not here. Not now. "Yeah," Noah said, leaning back in his chair. "He was my father." Tate's reaction wasn't what Noah expected. The officer seemed genuinely startled for a moment. His eyes widened, and he blinked a few times as if trying to absorb the weight of what he had just learned. He let out a low, nervous chuckle and shook his head. "Well, I'll be damned," Tate muttered, mostly to himself. "Jack Reynolds' kid." Noah's mind was racing now. Why the sudden interest in his father? Why did Tate seem so unnerved by the connection? "What does my father have to do with this?" Noah asked, keeping his voice steady. Tate didn't respond right away. He stared down at the table, his expression distant, like he was running through a series of calculations in his head. Then, after what felt like a lifetime, he looked up. "You really don't know, do you?" Tate said, a flicker of something dark passing over his face. Noah's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm, leaning in slightly. "No," he said. Tate's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "Let's just say your father was snooping where he shouldn't have been," he said, "and he paid the price for it." Noah's blood ran cold. Noah sat at his desk, staring at the computer screen, but his mind wasn't on the report in front of him. Tate's words from the interrogation room kept replaying in his head. Your father was snooping where he shouldn't have been, and he paid the price for it. Noah had spent years trying to push past the trauma of his father's murder, filing it away as a random act of violence. But the way Tate had reacted, the surprise in his voice, and the sudden interest in Jack Reynolds, it didn't feel random anymore. It felt personal. He closed the report he'd been working on and leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the desk. His father's old case files. He hadn't looked at them in years. After the funeral, there had been too much pain, too much grief. But now, with fresh eyes, there was a chance, just maybe, that they held answers. His father had been a good cop, too good to let something slip through the cracks. If he'd been investigating corruption, there had to be a trail. Noah stood up, taking a breath, and headed down to the archives. The old precinct building was quieter than he remembered. His key card still worked. He hadn't been here in years, but there was a certain heaviness as he stepped into the musty basement where decades of case files were stored. Rows of metal shelves stretched out before him, filled with boxes of reports, evidence logs, and case summaries. Noah found the section marked 1990 to 1995. His father had been killed in 1994. It didn't take long to find Jack Reynolds' name on the side of a box. He pulled it out, carrying it to a nearby table. The case files inside were mostly routine: traffic stops, drug busts, small-time criminals. Noah flipped through them, frowning. Nothing jumped out. Then, at the bottom of the box, tucked beneath a stack of old reports, he found something different. A small notebook. Its pages were worn and yellowed with age. His father's handwriting covered the front. For eyes only. Noah's pulse quickened as he opened it. The first few pages were cryptic, filled with shorthand notes and initials that didn't mean much without context. But as he flipped through, pieces started to fall into place. There were names, officers Noah recognized from the precinct, including some that were still around today. Next to the names were question marks, arrows, and phrases like suspected ties to organized crime and cash deposits unaccounted for. His father had been on to something big. Noah's eyes scanned the pages as the notes grew more specific. His father had been tracking movements, drug shipments, meetings that didn't add up, officers clocking in and out of shifts they weren't scheduled for. It was all connected. And then a date jumped out at him, July 1994, the summer his father was killed. The last few pages of the notebook were rushed, the handwriting sloppier, moving faster than expected. Someone's on to me. I think I'm being followed. We'll meet with Roy to confirm details. Noah's heart stopped. Roy. Officer Roy Tate. His father had been working with Tate, or at least he thought Tate might know something. Noah flipped back through the earlier pages, finding another note. Carter might be the key. Higher than we thought. Someone else pulling the strings. The writing was smudged, almost unreadable, but Noah could make out the gist. The Carter ring wasn't some small-time operation. His father had been close to unearthing a conspiracy. Noah sat back. The weight of the realization crashed over him. His father's death hadn't been random. Jack Reynolds had been digging too deep, getting too close to the truth, and for that, he was killed. Noah closed the notebook, his fingers trembling. Everything was connected. The drug ring, the corrupt cops, and now Tate. His father had died because of the same operation Noah was investigating. Tate's reaction earlier made sense now. He had known all along, but he wasn't the only one. Noah stood in the observation room, watching through the two-way mirror as Roy Tate sat in the interrogation room fidgeting. The officer had been arrested earlier that morning. His house had been swarmed with agents after Noah had pulled enough evidence to bring him in. Tate had tried to play it cool during the arrest, but Noah could see the cracks now. In the stark, empty room, Tate looked less confident, more nervous. Noah straightened his tie and walked into the room, closing the door behind him. He dropped a thick case file on the table with a loud thud and took a seat across from Tate. The room was silent for a moment, the only sound the faint ticking of the wall clock. "Officer Tate," Noah began, his voice steady but firm. "You know why you're here." Tate crossed his arms, leaning back in the chair with force, nonchalant. "I'm not saying anything without my lawyer." Noah smirked. "Sure, you can have your lawyer, but that's not going to change the fact that we've got more than enough to bury you. You're in deep, Tate. Drug money, backdoor deals, aiding and abetting one of the biggest trafficking rings in the state." Tate's eyes flickered for just a second, nervousness creeping in, but he didn't say anything. Noah leaned forward, tapping the case file. "Your bank records, surveillance footage, phone logs, all of it ties you directly to the Carter ring. We've got witnesses who've seen you talking to their guys, and the deposits in your account don't exactly scream honest cop. So here's your chance to come clean. Make it easier for yourself." Tate clenched his jaw. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You're fishing." Noah shot back. "You think this is fishing?" Opening the file, he spread out the documents in front of Tate. "We've got enough to pin you for at least 10 years. But you know, that's not the worst part. You've been around long enough to know what happens to guys like you in lockup, especially ones that turn their back on the force." Tate's facade cracked just a bit, his fingers twitching against the table. Noah pressed forward. But before Tate could speak, Noah asked, "Why don't we start simple, Tate? Tell me about the night Jack Reynolds was murdered." Tate's head snapped up. His eyes were wide. It was the first time Noah had seen real fear in them. "You remember him, don't you?" Noah asked, his voice cold. "My father." Tate didn't answer. He shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the mirror. Noah's voice dropped, steady and deliberate. "You were there, weren't you? That night by the lake." The two masked men. Tate's silence was answer enough. Noah stood leaning over the table, anger simmering in his voice. "You murdered him." "I didn't pull the trigger," Tate snapped, his voice suddenly desperate. His eyes were wide with panic. "I didn't shoot him." Noah froze, his heart pounding. The admission hung in the air, heavy and raw. "I was there," Tate admitted, his voice cracking. "Yeah, but I didn't kill him. I was just following orders." Noah sat back down slowly, trying to keep control even as rage boiled inside him. "Who gave the orders, Tate?" Tate hesitated, his eyes darting around the room like a man trapped with no escape. "Look, I was a nobody back then, a low-level cop," Tate mumbled. "I didn't have a choice." He was snooping around, asking questions about things that were way above his pay grade. Things he shouldn't have been digging into. "What things?" Noah pressed. Tate swallowed hard. "Your old man. He was close, too close, to exposing something big. The Carter ring, sure, but that wasn't the half of it. The whole precinct was involved. Cops, lieutenants, all of them on the take. He didn't know when to back off." Noah's fist tightened under the table. "Who else was there that night, Tate?" Who was the other man? Tate's face paled. He shifted in his seat, looking down at his cuffed hands, avoiding Noah's eyes. "If I tell you, they'll kill me," Tate muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll protect you," Noah said firmly. "You give me a name, and I'll make sure you get witness protection. You won't serve a single day in prison if you help us take him down." Tate stared at the table for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he looked up, his eyes hollow, his voice shaking. "You don't get it," Tate said. "This guy, he's untouchable. Been in the game longer than any of us. He's got friends in high places. If I give him up, I'm dead." "Who is it?" Noah demanded, his voice hardening. "Give me his name." Tate hesitated, then exhaled deeply, defeated. His voice was barely audible as he spoke the words that would change everything. "Frank Bennett." Noah's heart stopped. "Chief? Frank Bennett?" he repeated, his voice low and disbelieving. Tate nodded slowly. "Yeah. He was the other man that night. He pulled the trigger. He's been running the show ever since." Noah leaned back, his mind spinning. Chief Bennett, his father's old colleague, the man who had climbed the ranks and was now running the entire precinct, the man who had orchestrated his father's murder, the man he had trusted, respected, the same man who had taken his father's life. Tate slumped in his chair, his face etched with fear. "Now you know, but if you go after him, you better be ready for a war." Noah stood, staring down at Tate, his voice cold. "Thanks for the tip. I'll handle it from here." Noah leaned against the cold wall of the holding cell hallway, his mind buzzing with 1,000 thoughts. He had just come out of another meeting with the district attorney, arranging for Roy Tate's placement in witness protection. Tate had spilled too much. He'd practically signed his own death warrant the moment he mentioned Chief Bennett's name. Tate, however, wasn't reassured in the interrogation room. He'd been shaking, unable to sit still. Noah had seen fear before, but this was something else, pure panic. "They're going to kill me," Tate had muttered, pacing the small room, his cuffed hands trembling. "You don't understand. Bennett's got reach everywhere. I won't make it through the night. I've got you covered," Noah had said, his voice calm but firm. "We're moving you out of here. You'll be safe. Witness protection is airtight." Tate had stopped pacing, turning to Noah with wide eyes. "There's no safe from Bennett. He runs everything. He'll find me no matter where you put me." Noah had seen the desperation in the Tate's eyes, but he had tried to reassure him. "Stay calm. Follow protocol. You'll be out of here soon. Just hold tight." Tate was their key witness. With his testimony, they could bring Bennett down. The plan was already in motion. The next morning, Noah arrived at the office, hoping to move forward with the case. But the moment he stepped inside, he was met with grim faces. Karen Hall approached him, her face pale, lips pressed into a thin line. "Noah," she said quietly, "there's something you need to hear." "What is it?" Noah asked, his stomach sinking. "Tate's dead," Hall said, her voice almost too soft to hear. Noah froze. "What?" he whispered, barely able to comprehend her words. "They found him dead in his cell early this morning. They're calling it a suicide." Noah's blood ran cold. Suicide. There was no way Tate had been terrified, yes, but he had been desperate to live, not to end his own life. Hall glanced around the room, lowering her voice. "Look, it's all being reported as a clean suicide. The higher-ups are sticking to it, but you and I both know what this is." Noah clenched his fists. Tate had been silenced. Bennett had reached him, even in custody. He could feel it. He'd seen this game played before. The chief was cleaning house, and Tate had been the first casualty. Noah's gut twisted. He was next in line. "You need to be careful," Hall warned, her voice low. "If Bennett's this deep, he'll come for you next." Noah nodded. The weight of the situation was settling in. He was in the crosshairs now, but he wasn't going to back down. The chief had to pay, and Noah wasn't about to let fear stop him. Noah's phone buzzed on his desk, snapping him out of his thoughts. A text message. He unlocked the screen and stared at the message. "Back off, Reynolds, or you're next." No sender, no number, just a warning. Noah tightened his grip on the phone. His jaw clenched. He'd been expecting this. He knew it would come eventually, but it didn't make the reality any less chilling. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He glanced up, catching Karen Hall's eye across the room. She'd been watching him closely ever since Tate's suicide. She gave him a nod as if to say, "We're in this together." But even with her support, Noah couldn't shake the feeling that this was now his fight and his alone. Later that night, Noah drove home through the quiet city streets. The adrenaline from the day still pumped through his veins, keeping him on edge. Every shadow, every flash of headlights made his skin prickle. He checked his rearview mirror for the third time in 5 minutes. Nothing. But he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. Waiting. His phone buzzed again. Another text message. "Last chance, Reynolds. Stop digging or you won't make it home." Noah's heart pounded. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, eyes scanning the road ahead. This was it. He was next on Bennett's list, just like Tate had warned. Suddenly, a dark van shot out from a side street, ramming into the rear of Noah's car. His head snapped back from the impact. His heart leaped into his throat. His car swerved violently as he fought to regain control. Before he could react, 2 masked men on motorcycles appeared on either side of his car, guns drawn. Just like the night his father was killed. Noah slammed on the gas, his car roaring forward. But the men didn't back off. They opened fire, bullets smashing into the driver's side window. Glass shattered around him. Noah ducked, swerving wildly through the street. Adrenaline surged through him as he yanked the wheel hard to the left, slamming one of the motorcyclists against a parked car. The rider spun out, crashing into the pavement with a sickening thud. But the other motorcyclist stayed on his tail, gunfire still raining down on Noah's car. His mind raced, heart pounding. Noah reached under the seat and grabbed his Glock. Eyes locked on the road ahead, he slammed the wheel to the right, crashing into the bike. The rider swerved to keep balance. Noah fired 2 shots out the shattered window. The rider jerked backward, losing control and tumbling off the bike onto the road. Breathing hard, Noah floored the gas, putting as much distance between him and the attackers as possible. The van that had first hit him was still in pursuit, its headlights bearing down on him. Another gunshot rang out, shattering the rear window. Noah's pulse raced as he made a sharp turn down an alley, the narrow space barely wide enough for his car. The van screeched to a halt at the entrance, but its size prevented it from following. His hands shook as he sped through the alley, his car rattling from the damage. The moment he hit open road again, relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. His arm felt warm, too warm. He glanced down and saw blood soaking his sleeve. One of the bullets had grazed him. A sudden dizziness hit him. His vision blurred as the adrenaline began to wear off. He fought to keep his focus, his foot heavy on the gas. He couldn't stop. Not yet. The next thing Noah remembered was waking up to the harsh, sterile lights of the hospital room. His head throbbed, and his arm was bandaged. The sting of the wound dulled by painkillers. Karen Hall stood at the foot of his bed, arms crossed, her face a mix of anger and concern. "Hell of a night, huh?" she said, her voice low. Noah groaned, pushing himself upright. "How bad?" "You got lucky," she said. "A bullet grazed your arm, but it could have been worse. You passed out from blood loss. We almost lost you." Noah leaned back against the pillow, wincing as the memories of the attack flooded back. It was them. Hall, Bennett's guys. Same tactics they used on my father. They're not just warning me anymore. They're coming to finish the job. Hall's expression hardened. "We've got to move fast. Bennett's not going to stop until you're dead." Noah lay in his hospital bed, staring at the sterile ceiling, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor his only company. His arm throbbed under the bandages. The painkillers did little to numb the ache. The attack had left him physically drained, but his mind raced. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. A tall man in a white coat stepped in, carrying a clipboard. He had a calm demeanor, glasses perched low on his nose. "Agent Reynolds?" the man asked, his voice smooth, professional. "I'm Dr. Marshall, just here to check on you." Noah's instincts flared instantly. He hadn't heard of any doctor. Marshall. His regular doctor had just left, and there hadn't been any mention of a follow-up visit this soon. Something was off. "Yeah," Noah muttered, keeping his tone casual. "Everything okay?" Dr. Marshall smiled, stepping closer to the bed. His eyes scanned the clipboard. "Just need to check your vitals. Routine. Nothing to worry about." But Noah was already on edge. He watched the man's hands carefully, noticing the slight twitch in his right hand, the way his fingers brushed against the inside of his coat pocket. The man's movements were too deliberate, too rehearsed. "All right," Noah said slowly, shifting in the bed. "Go ahead." The doctor reached into his coat pocket. Noah's pulse quickened. A syringe. Before the man could make his move, Noah acted on pure instinct. He swung his injured arm up, knocking the syringe from the man's hand. It clattered to the floor. But the fake doctor didn't hesitate. His other hand shot out, grabbing Noah by the throat and forcing him back against the bed. Noah gasped, his vision blurring for a moment as the grip tightened around his windpipe. But he wasn't about to go down without a fight. He reached out, grabbing the IV stand next to the bed, yanking it free, and swinging it with as much force as he could muster. The metal pole connected with the man's shoulder, causing him to stumble back. Noah coughed, gasping for air as he scrambled off the bed, his head spinning from the sudden movement. The pain in his arm flared up, but he pushed through it. The assassin lunged at him again, this time pulling a knife from his coat. Noah barely had time to react, dodging the blade as it sliced through the air inches from his face. He grabbed the nearest object, a bedside table, and shoved it into the man's path, trying to buy himself a second to think. The two men clashed again, fists and limbs flying. The assassin was fast, but Noah was driven by adrenaline. He blocked the next knife strike with his forearm, gritting his teeth against the pain, and slammed his fist into the man's jaw. The impact sent the assassin stumbling backward, blood trickling from his lip. Noah wasted no time. He grabbed the assassin by the collar, yanking him toward the floor. The knife clattered out of his hand as Noah pinned him down, pressing his knee into the man's chest. "Who sent you?" Noah growled, his voice hoarse from the strain. "Bennett," the man sneered, his eyes full of malice. "You're already dead." Noah slammed the man's head against the tile floor, knocking him out cold. Breathing heavily, Noah stood up, his body trembling with exhaustion and pain. He staggered back to the bed, hitting the call button with his fist. Minutes later, hospital security and staff rushed into the room. The unconscious assassin was handcuffed and dragged away by law enforcement. Noah sat on the edge of the bed, his pulse still racing, adrenaline still coursing through his veins. Karen Hall arrived not long after, her face pale when she saw the damage to the room. "Jesus, Noah," she muttered. "They sent someone after you here." "Bennett's getting desperate," Noah said, his voice low. "He knows I'm close. He's trying to tie up loose ends." Hall stood in silence for a moment before nodding. "We've got to move fast. That man won't stop until you're dead." Noah stood up, ignoring the throbbing in his arm. "This isn't just a case anymore. Bennett's not going to stop until he takes me out. I need to end this now." Hall's eyes met his, a mix of fear and resolve. She knew what was coming. They both did. "All right," she said quietly. "What's the plan?" Noah grabbed his jacket, his face set with determination. "We go straight to the top." Noah stood in front of the imposing house, its neat lawn and perfect porch light casting a warm glow over the street. It didn't fit. None of it did. Not the quiet suburban neighborhood, not the well-kept facade. This was the home of Frank Bennett, police chief, the same man Noah was sure had ordered the hit on him, just like he had on his father. His heart pounded as he raised his fist to knock. The truth was there, just behind this door. He wasn't leaving until he had answers. The door swung open, and Bennett stood there wearing a button-up shirt and slacks, his face a picture of ease, like he had just finished a peaceful evening at home. His smile was wide, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Noah," Bennett said, surprised but casual, "this is a late visit. What brings you here?" Noah forced a tight smile. "I need to talk. It's important." Bennett held the door open. "Come in. Sounds serious." Noah stepped inside, every sense on high alert. He glanced around at the photos on the wall, pictures of Bennett and his wife on vacations, smiling for the camera. He wondered how many of the people in those photos knew who Bennett really was. "Sit," Bennett offered, gesturing to the leather couch. "What's on your mind, son?" Noah stayed standing. "It's about the drug case," he started, his voice steady, probing. "We've been digging deeper, finding connections where we didn't expect them." Bennett nodded, though there was a flicker in his eyes. "That's good news, right? We need to root out all the rot in the precinct, always have." Noah narrowed his eyes. "That's what I thought, too, until we started finding the rot at the top." Bennett's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened just a little. He gave Noah a smile that was just a bit too forced. "You're talking about me, aren't you?" Noah didn't back down. "Your name's been coming up, Frank. Your old ties to some of the people we've been investigating. It's making people wonder." Bennett chuckled low and controlled, leaning back slightly in his chair. "I've been cleaning up this city for over 20 years. I've put more scumbags behind bars than you've had birthdays." "That might be true," Noah replied, stepping closer, keeping his voice calm. "But not all the scumbags ended up behind bars, did they?" The smile vanished. Bennett's eyes flicked to the side for a second, just long enough for Noah to catch it. He knew he'd struck a nerve. Noah pressed on. "I've been looking into my father's old files, his investigations, and it's interesting what I found. He wasn't just working on the usual corruption cases. He was digging into something deeper." Bennett's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Your father was a good cop, one of the best. Whatever he was working on back then, it was a long time ago. I don't see how it connects to anything now." Noah's voice dropped, the tension between them rising. "I think it connects perfectly. He was close to something big. That's why he was killed." For the first time, Bennett's mask slipped. A twitch of the mouth, a shift in his stance. Noah saw it. Bennett tried to cover it with a dismissive wave. "You're chasing ghosts, Noah," he said. "I told you, your father's death was a tragedy, but it was just a robbery gone wrong." Noah shook his head slowly. "No, it wasn't. It was an execution." Bennett's eyes locked onto Noah's, harder now, defensive. "I don't know what you think you're on to, but you're wrong." Noah stepped closer, his voice cold. "Am I? Then why did Tate die? Why was he killed after he named you?" The room fell into silence. Bennett didn't blink, didn't move. Noah watched him closely. The silence was heavy, crackling between them like a taut wire. Then Noah said it, the name that hung between them like a weight. "Did you know my father?" Bennett's face hardened. He glanced at Noah, his eyes narrowing. And for the first time, he didn't bother with the mask. He didn't even try to hide it. "Your father," Bennett said slowly, almost deliberately, "was a man who couldn't leave well enough alone." Noah's breath caught. He'd expected something, but the coldness in Bennett's tone sent a chill through him. He stepped forward, heart racing. "What do you mean?" The chief's expression remained cold. He was getting too close. "So yes, I had him taken care of." Noah's hands shook with rage, his blood boiling. "You murdered him." Bennett's eyes flashed. "I did what I had to do. Your father was about to blow everything wide open. If it wasn't me, it would have been someone else." The confession was out there now, raw and chilling. Bennett stood firm, his posture one of twisted pride. He seemed almost relieved to finally say it aloud. But no. Noah wasn't done. He stepped closer, his voice tight with fury. "Now, you're trying to do the same to me." Bennett smirked, a cruel glint in his eyes. "You should have backed off, kid. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." Noah couldn't hold back any longer. With a surge of rage, he lunged at Bennett, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him into the wall. Bennett gasped, but reacted quickly, shoving Noah back with surprising force. The room erupted in chaos. Bennett swung a fist, catching Noah in the ribs, knocking the wind out of him. But Noah recovered, throwing a punch that connected with Bennett's jaw, sending him stumbling back. "You're done, Bennett!" Noah shouted, charging at him again. Bennett growled, his face contorted with rage. He threw another wild punch, but Noah ducked, grabbing Bennett by the arm and twisting it behind his back. Bennett snarled in pain, trying to shake free, but Noah held him firm. "You think you can take me down?" Bennett spat, slamming his elbow into Noah's injured side. Noah grunted, pain shooting through his body, but he didn't let go. He shoved Bennett forward, sending him crashing into a nearby table, knocking over a vase. The chief scrambled to his feet, breathing heavily, his eyes wild with fury. He reached for a knife from the counter, lunging at Noah with desperate energy. But Noah was quicker. He sidestepped the attack and kicked Bennett's legs out from under him. The knife clattered to the floor. Before Bennett could get up, Noah was on him, pinning him down, holding him in place with all the strength he had left. "It's over," Noah said, his voice cold and steady. Bennett struggled beneath him, his breathing ragged. "You don't know what you've started, kid," he hissed. "You're out of your league." Noah didn't respond. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his handcuffs. "Chief Frank Bennett," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "You're under arrest for drug trafficking, corruption, and the murder of Jack Reynolds." Bennett's face twisted with fury as Noah cuffed his hands behind his back. "You'll regret this, Reynolds. You have no idea what's coming." Noah stood, pulling Bennett to his feet, ignoring the chief's threats. He led him toward the door, his grip firm. "I'll see you in court," Noah said, his voice ice-cold as he dragged Bennett out into the night. The weight of the moment settled over him. He had done it. His father's killer was finally in cuffs. Noah stood in front of his father's grave, feeling the peace of having fulfilled his promise. "It's over, Dad," he whispered. "I got him." And with that, Noah's battle for justice had been won. The fight was just beginning, but for now, there was peace.